Hey guys, how's it going? Preparing here. Today I'm going to do a video that I hope you guys find pretty interesting. It's kind of like somewhat specific analogy of what's going on in Arena. And you guys know I am strictly an Arena player. That's basically all I do when I play Hearthstone. I play a little bit Constructed, but not really. And I have a pretty good understanding of the game. And I think there is some sort of meta game involved where classes beat other classes, but because it's not exactly like Constructed, it's not like every hunter is playing basically the same Death Rattle Rush deck. It's Arena. You kind of get whatever cards you may get to choose from, and sometimes you don't pick the right ones because they don't come in the right order. Sometimes you get complete garbage. Sometimes you get an unbelievably good deck that just demolishes everything. So in addition to talking about the classes, in addition to talking about their matchups against the other classes, I want to talk about the significant cards in each class, how easy it is to get a good deck with each class, and lastly, how good these classes are without a good deck. And I'll give you guys mostly my opinion on this stuff, kind of how I see things. Things may actually be a little bit different, but at least the way that I play Arena, it seems to me like the game is this way. So here it is. Here's the chart I made up, and it's a little bit makeshift, but it has all the classes on the top, what I would consider their best card underneath it, and the matchups from best to worst. It's a little bit approximate, and I have it a little bit kind of by chunks because the first chunk is what I would consider good matchups, the chunk in the middle kind of, about even matchups, and the bottom chunk, bad matchups. And I'm going to explain why this is. And I'm going to do this one class at a time. And I do want to mention that overall, so you guys don't have to wait to the end of the video, yes, Mage right now is the absolute king of Arena. Usually when you go past like 6 or 7 wins, all you face are slow Mage decks. And that's because this type of play, this type of deck, is consistent enough against the rushy face decks that they're all basically eliminated. And sometimes the other also slow decks make it through this jungle of rush decks and get to duke it up with the mages for the 12-win spots. Also, the reason I want to do this video is we have Goblin versus Gnomes coming up, and a lot changed in Arena from the Naxx expansion. And with Goblins and Gnomes introducing many more cards, I'll do a video like this after I get a pretty good grasp of what's going on after that expansion to see what really has changed. Through Naxx, we've really seen Mage become even more powerful, and that's because they get a lot of secret interaction with Mad Scientist. Like a turn 2 Mad Scientist from a Mage is like a game over. It's one of those things that doesn't happen too often, but when it does happen, you lose. So that part really sucks. Because of that, because Mage has Flame Strike, which is 4 damage to the whole board, Mage is the reigning king of Arena still. And in my opinion, I consider the next tier, like top tier classes in Arena, as Rogue, Druid, Warlock, and Priest. Rogue and Druid because they have the 1 damage hero power, so even if you get a complete terrible draft, you can kind of make up for that by playing more greedy or less greedy depending on your matchup, depending on that kind of stuff. And it's also not too hard to get a good deck. Priest is kind of the same. With Priest, you just need big enough creatures and just enough early game to survive to make it through the late game, and Priest mostly does very well because it's a very good counter to the slow Mage. You can pretty much focus on getting few big creatures on the board rather than many of them, and if you play strategically, if you pace yourself, if you play slow, even with a pretty crappy deck, you can beat a lot of Mages. And if you're lucky enough to just face Mage after Mage after Mage, unless they have too insane of a deck, you'll be doing just fine. And Warlock I consider very, very strong because even if you get bad cards, you can afford to draw them because you can just use your hero power to draw something else if you're not happy with what you have. Now the other classes, they're all still pretty good. With a good enough deck behind a good enough or lucky enough player, every single class in the game can somewhat easily get 12 wins in Arena. If you get lucky enough, if you're good enough, if you get a good enough deck. So in that regard, it is pretty well balanced, but it is sad to see still Mage being at the top. So why is Mage at the top? Well, Mage has Flame Strike, and it makes playing against Mage very frustrating. When they play a big creature, usually the response in Arena is to play, well, a bigger creature. And Mage has removal for that with Polymorph, often with Fireball, and because it's arena, sometimes you don't have a big creature. Sometimes you just don't draw your big creatures. But you can't actually play too many small creatures, or you just lose the game to Flamestrike because you can't draw the cards that you lose from the value of that trade. So that makes playing as Mage a real pain in the ass. Mage has a premium hero power. Against Paladin, you can just ping, ping, ping all little dudes, no big deal. You can get rid of all the divine shields. You can even ping and enrage your own creatures, so it has the most flexible hero power in Arena as well. Mage has it all. If you have an option to pick Mage in Arena, go for it. Mage does very well against Rogue because often the Rogue will take a lot of damage just attacking into minions with the dagger hero power or a weapon. And at that point in the game, you can just choose. So yeah, he's got 16 life. I got 2 fireballs in hand. I'll just go face and win. So it's kind of like a back and forth game. But then if the game goes on for too long because the rogue attacked into too many minions, the mage just automatically wins. And that is a real sad time for the rogue. Against Shaman, again, Shaman really relies on building the board. Without the board, the Shaman doesn't have too many strong cards. The Shaman doesn't have too many board clears, so the Mage can just pretty much zerg the board as much as possible. Paladin's a little bit worse than Shaman because you do get a lot of Consecrates, and the Consecrates, it's more common on Lightning Storm, so you can't exactly zerg the board with too many small minions, and True Silver keeps the mid-game in the Paladin's favor. So sometimes the Paladin does okay, but in general, you kind of win with just the Flame Strike hits and the Fireball and the Polymorphs on the big creatures. Against Warlock, similar idea. You just kind of wipe their board again and again. Sometimes they get too strong of an opener. It usually has to do with Void Callers or Doom Guards to where you just can't deal with the tempo. But in general, you can, and even if you don't wreck them, they eventually just draw their deck and you win that way. Warrior and Druid have the stall mechanics. They often run big creatures. They often run taunts. Usually Flamestrike doesn't kill too many of them. And, you can't really ping them down because they can negate that with their own hero power. Hunter and Priest are really bad matchups for Mage. Hunter just burns the Mage down because the game past Naxx encourages to play secrets. Things like Flare, things like creatures that are spells like Animal Companion. It just kind of messes with it pretty hard. And you can get rushed down by Hunter very, very easily as a Mage. But specifically as a Priest, against a Priest as a Mage, if they get really big minions on the board that you can't kill with Fireball, if you don't have like a Polymorph, you pretty much just lose the game from there because the Priest hero power is just too powerful, plus all the heals that they may have with Holy Novas and Dark Scale Healers, all that kind of stuff. Mage is a really strong class because you can get a pretty damn good deck without even having Flame Strike. You can just get like a Blizzard, and you can get like maybe a Polymorph. If your creatures are big enough, there's so many mages, people are so terrified of mages that just being a mage, people will play around Flame Strike. They'll play around Fireball. So you get all these freebies, and it makes the game very, very easy. You don't need that great of a deck. Just play it pretty well, and you'll still do just fine. That's why Mage is at the top. Then you got Hunter. Hunter's pretty good, but Hunter requires quite a bit of cards. If you get a bad Hunter deck, it's kind of like rushing your opponent down, but instead of them dying before they kill you, you get them to 8 health every single time. So that's kind of the problem. Hunter with a good deck is unstoppable. Hunter with a bad deck is stopped. Like, you do nothing. And that kind of really is the biggest downfall of Hunter. It's just not consistent enough. Hunter is one of the classes I almost never pick when I play Arena. Does well against Mage, Rogue, Warlock, and Shaman because all those classes are just pretty easy to rush down. Warrior is not easy to rush down, but because Warrior in Arena relies so much on getting value with weapons, and it's not like you get shield blocks, you get heal mechanics, you get armor smiths, you can't really heal past the Hunter hero power, so that kind of puts them at a disadvantage. Paladin's kind of in the same boat where they can't really heal too much. Like, Paladins has heals, that's why it's a little better off than Shaman, but still not too great. Priest does very well against Hunter because Priest has a lot of cards that deal with all annoying little Naxx creatures that are hard to remove. With Shadow Mans, like Cabal Shadow Priest, with Shadow Word Pains, with Silences, with Holy Novas, all that kind of crap does really well for the Priest, and the Priest can often negate the hero power because they get heals past their hero power to negate the Hunters. Druid does really well because Druid just usually runs into drafting big taunts and swipes and wraths. And swipes and wraths deal with most Hunter creatures, and big taunts deal with weapons and chargers. So that and their hero power pretty much makes them take 1 damage a turn, the clock is much slower against the Druid, and you're the one who usually takes too much damage before they die. Druid's got a good matchup against Warrior, Paladin, Rogue, Hunter for a few different reasons. Against Warrior, Rogue, and Hunter, it is because of the big taunts, it is because of the swipes. It's mostly good against Warrior because the Warrior weapons don't really work if someone is running creatures that are just too big and taunt, and Druid's got Druid of Claws and Ironbark, which are two units that just don't die to weapons. Yes, they die to Gore Howl, but as a Warrior, you're not going to expect to draft a Gore Howl every single time. As a Druid, the main issue is that you can get a little bit of a bad deck, and Swipe is just such a big card. So for some classes, like let's say Hunter, Unleash is, in my opinion, the best card, but it's marginally so. They have a lot of good cards. But for Druid, Swipe is by far the best card. And if you don't have Swipe, if you don't get Starfall, it's kind of like playing a Mage with a board clear. And Mage is not as scary as Druid, so often that doesn't really work. People sometimes just don't give a shit. They don't play around Swipe, and you lose the game because you get zerged down. So Paladin kind of has that sometimes. If you don't have Swipe, it doesn't do so well, but if you do, you tend to do quite well. Druid sometimes doesn't do too well against Warlock because even though you have efficient removal, you have big creatures. Often Druid decks are a bit slow in the early game, and if the Warlocks get a big lead, you're always playing from behind, and the Warlock just gets to draw too many cards, and it doesn't really matter that your cards are so much better individually because they just draw way more of them. For Mage, it really depends on the deck. If you're playing a Druid and you don't have many creatures that survive Flame Strike, you're not going to do well against the Mage. But if you do, yeah, you're going to do pretty well against the Mage. Druid's poor matchups are Shaman and Priest. Shamans because of Hex. What happens is you have a lot of mid-game, but Shaman mid-game is usually about as good or better than Druid mid-game, and Druid kind of reigns king in the end game. But when you start playing stuff like Ironbark and it gets hexed, it's just a catastrophic tempo balance. I mean, you can't recover from that. You waste your whole turn playing a creature that they remove for 3 mana, and they play a big creature. And the Druid, it doesn't have Flame Strike. It has like kind of minor removal, like Swipe with Starfall. So you can't really come back from those kinds of shifts. And it's the same idea with Priest. Like you can't even play an Ironbark if you're on turn 10 and the Priest has a card in hand. Unless you're about to lose, you can't play Ironbark, because if you play it, in one case it's going to get deathed, so 3 mana, kind of like the Hex removal, very efficient removal, big tempo swing. But on the other hand, it can get mind controlled. If he gets mind controlled, you've certainly lost. So that's kind of the issue with Druid. As a Paladin, we've seen a lot of Paladins make it pretty high up in the wins. I've seen a lot of Paladins at like 10, 11, 12 wins in Arena, but I'm not really too sure why this is. In general, Paladin is a class that needs a good deck to do well, but it's not that hard to get one. The main card is True Silver because it keeps you on the board, it keeps your mid-game in shape, and True Silver is also very well complemented by Consecrate, because True Silver doesn't do too well if there's too many small minions, and Consecrate kind of works with that. So if you get True Silvers, if you get Consecrates, you're in good shape as a Paladin. And because of that, you pretty much destroy Warrior, especially because of your 1/1s. A Warrior cannot deal with 1/1 every single turn, and they build up, and at some point it's just impossible to deal with. Same reason against the Priest. Priest just cannot deal with the Paladin hero power. All the 1/1s stack up, and it makes the big creatures just irrelevant. So if the Priest loses board control because you have True Silver, because you have Consecrate, all those 1/1s stack up, and it's just over. It doesn't matter that they play a Temple Enforcer, because you get your True Silver and you just lose 2 dudes for it, so it's no big deal. Shaman kind of plays exactly the same way as the Paladin, but the problem is that Paladin can get Consecrate, which is a common card, and Shamans have to get Lightning Storm, which is a rare card. So it's kind of like both classes are playing exactly the same game, but Paladin is going to have way more board clears than the Shaman. That's why it favors the Paladin so much, in my opinion. And also, because it's usually a game based on the low end, the mid game, the fact that Shaman has better removal like Hex doesn't really matter too much in the game, generally. Paladin does pretty well against Warlock, but if the Warlock gets the opener, and if you don't get Consecrates, usually lose against Warlock just because they have too much stuff. Your hero power doesn't really matter because it gets efficiently traded by 1 or 2 drop creatures all the time. Against Hunter, if you don't get too many heals, if you don't get too much early game, you usually get burned down. Even with Consecrates, even with True Silver, it doesn't really work too much. You kind of need the creatures to stop their creatures in the start of the game, and you usually need at least some kind of healing or, you know, an above average amount of taunts to stop the damage coming through in the late stage of the game. Against Rogue, Druid, and Mage, it's pretty bad. All those classes can deal with all your creatures at the start, usually give up the early game, and it's pretty hard to come back from that point from all of them. And against Mage, that continues throughout the game. If they have board clear after board clear, your chance to win is very low. Priest does well against Druid, as I mentioned, because you mess up all their big creatures. Priest does well against Mage because you can stall the game, you can be careful, you can counter Flame Strike with big creatures that you keep healing up. It counters Warrior because both classes are kind of slow-paced in general. They can't really rush you down the weapons because you keep healing that damage often. And what ends up happening is your hero power is much better than the Warrior because not only can you heal yourself for 2, you can also heal the creatures for 2. So Warrior pretty much always loses. You're also pretty good against Hunter because you can heal a lot of the damage, as I mentioned, and you can deal with a lot of the small creatures. Priest is okay against Rogue. The Rogue usually wins the opener. The Priest has a lot of comeback mechanics, but it's sometimes pretty hard to come back from a Rogue. If they have like Cold Bloods, Eviscerate, or if they drop a Sprint on you, you're pretty much out of the game. They drew too many cards, or they have too much board control where you can't heal up, and it's just over at that point. Against Warlock, it's because you don't really apply too much pressure that often the Warlock is able to draw uncontrollably. And Shaman and Paladin, as I mentioned, because they keep pumping out those creatures on the board, it's just very, very difficult to deal with. If you want a direct comparison, it's like, let's say you have a 3/3 creature, and every turn the Paladin is playing a 1/1, and every turn you have to attack the 1/1 with your 3/3, which is usually like a pretty good thing. But, because you have to heal it, what ends up happening is the Paladin is like evening up the hero powers in terms of mana, because often you're healing even 1 damage, and the Paladin's like absorbing 3 damage a turn on top of that. So, it really, really messes up with the Priest. Shaman a little bit less so. Totems are often easier to kill than the 1/1 guys, and the totems are often less significant than the 1/1 guys from the Paladin. Best Priest card is a Naxx card. It is, in my opinion, the Dark Cultist. The Dark Cultist is just a very solid card. It's very scary. If you coin out a Dark Cultist, the Mage cannot deal with it on 3 mana. You can't Frostbolt it. You have to Frostbolt it and trade. So, and if he waits, you put a creature. It just dominates Mage. It dominates the pre-mid game, the 3-drop slot. It's so insane. And the Priest doesn't usually win the game at that point. But if the Priest is at like max life with at least back and forth board control by turn 6 or 7, that pretty much is a win. So it's a card that leads you to the late game, allowing you to win, because that's where the strength of the Priest is. Warlock, again, you kind of do well against classes that are pretty slow to take off, that usually allow you to use your hero power. If you draw too many cards, it doesn't really matter how good your deck is. You just, pump all the stuff out of your deck. As you guys saw me play with the worst card arena, I almost always play Warlock when I do that, because even though half my deck is complete garbage, the other half sometimes isn't too bad, and if I draw it consecutively, it's gonna go pretty well. So it does well against the Priest, Shaman, Warrior. Those classes don't have very good board clears. They don't have very good early game in general. Fiery War Axe for Warrior can be a really big deal against Warlock, but I've found that just with the draw power, if you have a balanced deck with tempo, with Void Callers, which, just absolutely crushes Warrior, it doesn't really matter too much if they have a Fiery War Axe, so you can just get out of control. Druid is pretty good against Warlock if they have a bunch of swipes and if they have decent early game. Warlock's kind of the class that doesn't have many comeback mechanics. So like if Paladin, if they do like a big board clear, if they have a lot of Consecrates, like if you play against a Paladin which has like 3 or 4 Consecrates as a Warlock, you're going to have a really, really sad time. For the same reason, Mage is not a very good matchup. Rogue also does pretty well. They don't have board clears, but they have very efficient removal in the early game. So you may have like a Flame Imp, but then they backstab it. Then you play a creature, then it's Deadly Poison Weapon, then your creature's dead. So, you can't get anything working on the board. They get like the first Yeti, and then, it's just kind of over, because you don't have those comeback mechanics. You don't have a backstab. Yeah, you have Soulfire, but you're usually going to need much more than one to come back from a good rogue opener. Against the Hunter, it doesn't really matter what you do, you usually just lose because Hunters kind of play the same game that you do. Early game garbage, it goes back and forth, but while it's going back and forth, you're losing 2 life from their hero power and 2 life from your hero power. So what ends up happening is it's a very close game where you're usually 1 or 2 turns away from killing them, but then you're dead to hero power or like a kill command. So Hunter is really, really tough for Warlock to deal with if they have a good deck. Rogue is pretty good with just average cards, just because the hero power is nice, but it doesn't really work that well against classes that have like the burn. So against Warlock, Paladin, Shaman, they don't have too much direct damage. Priest is kind of in the middle, but Warrior with the weapons, Mage with the spells, Druids with swipes, the chargers, and Hunter with just the constant damage. Usually, your ability to get good trades with your weapon and that kind of stuff kind of bites you in the ass, and you just die because of that. So we'll have to see if they introduce some kind of healing or something like that in the next expansion for Rogue, because that's really all it needs, in my opinion. Shaman is all right. Some people really like Shaman Arena. I don't like it that much, largely because it's kind of difficult to make a good enough deck that it actually beats up the mages in the late game. You can do pretty well against most opponents, especially if you play against like a warrior priest. Druid also doesn't do too well against Shaman, just because the swipes often don't clear the board, and Druid is reliant on big creatures. So even though Shaman and Paladin have very similar hero power that works against some classes, Shaman has the hexes for the Ironbarks that the Paladin just doesn't have. So that is what makes Druid a pretty easy matchup for Shaman. Hunter is a bit difficult. If they have a lot of unleashes, you're pretty much screwed. You pretty much just die to little doggies hitting you the whole time. Paladin is a really bad matchup, just because Consecrate kills all your totems and often the rest of your creatures when they use their little dudes to finish off your bigger ones. Mage, if you run up against Mage, a bunch of board clears, you're dead. Rogue and Warlock, it's just very hard to get anything going because often their early game is just a little bit better. Now, Warrior is, in my opinion, the worst class in Arena. Even though you have good matchups, they're not really that good, except maybe Rogue. I think Warrior does do pretty well against Rogue because they use their hero power to get good trades, and then when they're down to like 14 life, you draw your Arcanite Reaper and you decide going for face is a very easy thing to do. It does all right against Hunter again, but not really that great. It's kind of like relative. So this list isn't too tentative. It's like Warrior might do pretty well against Hunter. It's the second one on the list, but it's still like, I don't know, playing Warrior really sucks unless you have a really good deck. And it's very hard to get a good deck and be balanced and not face too many Paladins and Shamans, because those little taunt totems, those little dudes, they are just ridiculous. And that's why, in my opinion, Deathspite is the best card that a Warrior can get. It is no longer Fiery War Axe, just because Fiery War Axe does deal with the early game okay, but you can't deal with all the 1/1s that just come out. So you do Fiery War Axe, and if you don't have much of a follow-up, it's just 1/1, 1/1, 1/1. You play something True Silver, and then it's just over. It's completely over. So it's very difficult to make it work. You do okay against Mage and Priest. Often you need executes for Priest, but executes don't work against the other classes. And against Mage, you do pretty well, but then if your creatures don't survive Flame Strike, if they have too many Water Elementals, suddenly you have no chance. So that's why I hate playing Warrior. I don't really like playing Hunter because it's so hard to make a good deck. But overall, I think everything is in a pretty decent place. I really hope that Mage doesn't get the best side of things when it comes to the Goblins vs. Gnomes expansion. But overall, I hope you guys enjoyed my analysis of the meta game in Arena. And, well, time will tell how it will change. But you guys have to keep in mind, like, even though there are a lot of set things, in Arena, anything can happen. You can just get the craziest deck ever. I think my best performance ever in Arena was actually a Warrior, where I kind of got 13-0 because I disconnected on a match that I would have won, and I won 12 the other ones. I didn't lose any other game. And, Warrior's like the worst class, right? So that's how it is. Luck has a big factor, the deck has a big factor, and the player has somewhat of a big factor. Oh well. Good stuff. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you guys tomorrow.